I've drawn my armholes in the back, and then I counted my pleats to find the center, and at the very center I cut it, and I have the extra threads here for pleating on the side. I'm going to put my continuous band in the back, and if you need a refresher on how to make a continuous band, I have a different video on that, and I'll include a link below. And after the continuous band is on, then I will tie this off to size to fit the two upper bodice pieces for the back bodice. I have the top row of the back smocked, and so now I'm going to put the yokes onto the back. I can smock the rest of that later. I've also prepared my yokes. I've interfaced, and I actually used batiste as opposed to an iron-on interfacing, but you can use whichever you prefer. So I've interfaced each side of the back yoke, and I've applied my piping and pressed it back to the wrong side. Now the next thing you want to do before anything else is to remove the cording from inside the piping, because that will eliminate a lot of bulk. So I'm going to stick a pin through the cording here so that I don't inadvertently pull all of it out, and I'm going to pull out this much cording and trim it off. So it's a educated guess here, but it should work. Okay. Now I've pulled it out, and it's not quite where I need it to be, so I can go from the other end and pull a little bit of it out of this side to get the cording to stop right at the fold line there. There, I can feel that's past that. Now I'm going to fold this back so that once this is stitched down, that the cording will end at exactly the same place as the fold of the fabric. So stick that out of the way. And it's hard to tell on a print, but this is the fold of the fabric right there. Now the next thing to do is to apply the yoke to the skirt. And you can do this with glue like we did the front, but I don't like to wait for the glue to dry, so I tend to use this Wash Away Wonder tape. It's a water-soluble tape, so once the garment is either soaked or laundered, this tape will disappear. To apply the tape to the yoke, one side is sticky and the other side has a paper facing that will be removed. So you want to finger press this tape to the seam allowance of the yoke. And another thing that I want to mention, when we applied the piping to the front yoke, we stitched as closely as possible to the piping to the yoke of the front, and that was because we were going to stitch in the ditch to attach it. To apply the back yokes to the skirt, we are going to actually flip this over, and following this previous stitching line, we're going to stitch a thread closer to apply the yoke to the skirt. So you don't want to get it as close as possible on the first pass. You want to get it close, but on the next pass you will get it as close as possible. So I have the tape on one side, and then you want to remove the paper, and you're left with the sticky side of the tape, and you want to align the outside edge of the yoke with your drawn armhole, and then you can apply the rest of it as close as you would like it to be to your smocking. and that works out really nicely. And if you need to adjust it a little bit, you just lift it up and reposition it. So once you get it exactly the way you like it, you're going to bring this back to the sewing machine. You're going to flip this, whoops, I've got it caught here. You're going to flip this to the other side, and then you're going to stitch one thread closer to the cording or the piping than your previous stitching line, which you can see. So I have both my yokes stitched onto the back of the skirts, and I'm happy with the way that they look. So the next step is to attach the yoke facing for the front yoke. Now before I did that, I did go ahead and stay stitch around the neckline, and I also stitched along the seam allowance of the bottom yoke just to make it easier. When I go to whip that down, you'll know exactly where to turn that under. And so I find it helpful to turn it wrong sides out, and then you can match your facing, front facing to your back facing. So we're going to stitch both of these with the 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I'll press it open and trim the seam. I do have my yoke facing stitched to the front yoke lining to the back yoke lining. And before I go any further, I want to do the same thing that we did on the front, and that is I have pinned the armhole curve to the yoke, and I want to confirm and get the armhole curve exactly right. And I don't know if you can see this, but it's slightly different here, and that is primarily because I have a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you can see that there was more than 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric to the first row of smocking. And that happens quite a bit because it will vary depending on where your first row of smocking falls from the edge of the fabric. So for most accuracy, you want to double check that each time that you are, after you've got the yokes on. The next step is to sew the dress front to the dress back at the shoulder seams. And you could have done that first and then done the linings. It doesn't really matter which order you do it in, but this is how I'm doing it today. So you're going to pin your shoulder seams together here, the front of the dress to the back of the dress. And then again, you're going to sew that with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, trim it and press it open, and then we will be ready for the neckline. I've done the shoulder seams. I've pressed the seams open on both the front as well as on the linings. And now the next step is to pin the lining to the front of the dress. And just so that this helps make sense if you have trouble with it, you want to fold this back onto itself at the crease line at the back of the dress. You want to match up your shoulder seams and do that all around the dress. And then you're going to stitch around here, and after stitching it, you will trim the seam allowance and clip it at intervals so that it will turn underneath nicely, and then you need to understitch the neckline. I've stitched all around the neckline. I trimmed the seam allowance in half, and then I did clip regularly around the neckline. But before you start trimming and clipping in this dress, you want to make sure that your center front is exactly where it needs to be. So where this peak of the collar is, is where you want your seam line to be. So if it's not there when you first stitch it, you can go back and correct that, because as you can see from the pattern piece, it is supposed to be right there at the peak. I wanted to demonstrate understitching because I've seen so many people do it incorrectly. So you always want to understitch a neckline because that will hold the facing back so that it doesn't roll forward and show on the front. So to understitch, you want to start as close to the back as you can, and if your sewing machine has a needle down option, that's what you want to use. When you're understitching, many people hold the seam straight just like this and stitch straight just like that. That is not the best way to understitch, because what you've clipped this so that it can open up, these little notches can open up as you go around the neckline. If you're sewing it straight, you're keeping those notches closed up, so it sort of defeats the purpose. So when you understitch, you want to make sure, let me keep my needle down, you want to make sure that the lining portion stays flat against the bed of the sewing machine the same way that it would be when it's on your body. And you want to stitch right next to the seam line. So I generally get about 1/8 of an inch or closer to the seam line. But again, you're going through the seam allowance and the facing pieces, but you want to keep the facing flat the way it would be as it was worn on your body as you go around. So it does take adjusting as you make your way around the neckline. It's a little awkward, but you will get the best results this way. And you're gonna go as far as you can to the fold line. You won't be able to get all the way there, so get as close as you can. It'll probably be within 1/2 an inch or so, and then stop. So there you have it. It's all understitched, and after pressing, it will stay nicely and keep the lining fabric rolled to the inside of the garment. The understitching is completed, and it's probably very difficult to see this on the camera, but it is stitched right along the neckline here and almost to the back. I stopped about 1 inch short. So before we would whip down this front lining, we need to take care of the back lining. You could just trim this and turn the seam allowance under and whip it down by hand if you find machine stitching to be awkward. I prefer to do everything by machine that's possible. So in order to do that, you're going to take this lining, you're going to fold it over towards the front, so it's going to be, like I said, awkward, and you're going to match up your seam allowances here with this. You're going to stitch on top of this previous stitching line, and then after stitching there, you can trim your seam allowance in half and clip the corner at an angle and then turn it right side out. So folding over these facings and stitching them by machine has turned out really as a lovely finish. And you can see inside that I've trimmed the seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch. So the next thing that I want to do here is to baste at the sleeve hole edge the lining to the fashion fabric on front. But before doing that, if you haven't already done it, make sure that you remove the cording from the seam allowance both at the back yoke and at the front yoke, because that really helps with bulk. This concludes part 3 of the Becca's Float Dress Sew-Along. If you enjoyed this and you wish to stay informed when new videos are produced, please hit the subscribe button below.